Hi, this is session 11 in Criminal Justice 436, Crime in the Media. In this session, we'll be talking about Rafter's Introduction to Shots in the Mirror. Basically, this lecture will follow Rafter quite closely, so if you've already read that chapter, you'll be really familiar with the content that I'll be talking about. I'm going to go relatively quickly as well, so it doesn't take us a lot of time to move through this. But there are some major points I want us to think about and remember as we prepare for an exam later on. First of all, Rafter is presenting this book as a research project. And so the introduction is important because she outlines several of her assumptions about her crime films, about film in general, about her research project that we need to understand in order to interpret her chapters relatively easily and relatively well. And basically, she talks about what crime films do, first of all. She says crime films create a common language about crime. There was recently a murder in College Station, and someone responded to a bulletin board about the murder that he was a serial killer. Now, we know as criminal justice majors that there's a lot more that goes into diagnosing someone as a serial killer or not, but the word serial killer is quite familiar, and most people can come up conceptually with what they think a serial killer is just by hearing that language. A lot of that language comes from media, from film, from television, and so we have common ideas about what crime are, what crime offenders are. So when we hear this language, we have this language in common socially. She says that crime films also help us debate issues related to crime and punishment. Shawshank Redemption did this in terms of how punishment should be allocated, what kind of oversight should be given to prison officials. There are frequently films that come up. There was a film with Jodie Foster where she was gang raped that started a discussion about policies towards victims in rape trials and the identification of victims and the pursuit of victims' sexual history and whether it could be presented in trials. Her argument is sometimes films provide these events for us to debate issues related to crime and punishment, basically to discuss justice. And that's an important function that crime films serve in society. She says they pose problems and they often present solutions. So again, they shape our idea of not only what maybe corruption in a prison looks like, but how we might correct that problem. And then lastly, she says we study crime films simply because they're fun. And they're fun to watch, and everybody likes a good crime caper on occasion. Some of us more than others. But she started her study simply because she loved watching these kinds of films. She says that with other forms of media, again, kind of hearkening back, and I'm not going to hammer this point again, but hearkening back to that last chapter we talked about with Jukes, does art mimic life, or does life mimic art, is kind of the question that Rafter toys with in this introduction. And basically she says that, again, films both reflect and inform our thinking about crime, that there is this dynamic interplay between art and life. One of the best examples of this, if you remember, after 9/11, the government came out with several statements about how the problem wasn't necessarily a problem of enforcement, that preventing 9/11 couldn't have occurred because there was a problem of imagination, that the governmental agencies simply couldn't have imagined that that type of crime would have ever occurred. Now we know that it actually had occurred in a film prior to that, many years ago, but that was seen as fiction, as fantasy. It can't possibly happen in real life. So what the early stages of the Department of Homeland Security did was they called together directors, script writers, producers from Hollywood to brainstorm what a terrorist attack might look like next, and try to use Hollywood story writers basically to inform the imagination of what the government might anticipate. There was this interplay between art and life and real life and policy that was occurring at the time. Now, who's to say how wise that was? But I think that's a good example of how, again, the crime films both reflect our ideas and values, and they can inform our thinking about how about real solid policy and how we might prevent particular types of crime, how we should think about particular types of offenders. If you'll remember after that, negative portrayals of Arabs, and particularly in the show 24, began to get a lot more press after 9/11 as well. Should we be promoting negative attitudes towards particular groups of people simply because this group committed a crime? So there's this interplay between art and life. Okay, what do crime films allow us to do? Again, just to summarize, they allow us to criticize and comment on CJ players and institutions. Some of us do this more loudly than others. I've spoken before about how some of us like to talk back to the TV or to the movie screen. We like to, my son does this all the time, we like to have real relationships with fictitious characters on TV and in the movies. It allows us to participate in the criminal justice system in ways that we're not usually able to do that. Particularly if you're not a police officer or a judge or a participant in those institutions regularly, you can participate simply through consuming crime media. Excuse me. You can also challenge the system. We can buck the system if we think that there's a law that's unjust. We can kind of vicariously engage in illegal behavior, or in behavior we might not necessarily ever consider engaging in real life, because it's fun. If you've ever tried to imagine the perfect crime or how you might get away with a perfect crime, we often do that as a result of what we've seen on the media, or the latest movie that we've seen. Well, if I would have done that, I wouldn't have blah blah blah. I'm thinking of a lot of the slasher films that Rafter talks about later on, how the women generally make just really bad decisions. Well, I wouldn't do that. We're able to vicariously interact in that either the act of deviance, the act of committing the crime, or we're able to vicariously restore order, be on the side of the officers or the court or the individual that has been pursuing justice. We can vicariously restore justice at the end of the film too. So we're able to kind of set the balance of justice. If it goes a kilter in a film, we're often able to vicariously set it right. Rafter calls this happy hypocrisy, that we're able to enjoy being an offender and we're able to enjoy having moral order restored. If you can think of a film where moral order hasn't been restored, at the end of the film we often feel cheated. We often feel like that's not something's gone wrong in the film. We come out upset because moral order's not been restored. We've not been allowed to, again, have justice or see justice done, because as much as we might want to identify with the offender, we also want to see that justice restored at the end of the film. Now, in those films where we identify with the transgressor, and this is a scene from Ocean's, I think this is Ocean's 11, it might be Ocean's 12, I'm not sure. But even in those films where we're able to identify with the offender, we still are able to see justice done. In most films where we're sympathetic, with George Clooney or with, Matt Damon and a really smart crime is being done, we're still happy at the end of that film because someone has received justice. Maybe it's a powerful person or someone in authority who's received their comeuppance because of the crime that's been committed. In almost every film where we're led to identify with the offender, that offender brings about justice in some way at the end of the film. Shawshank Redemption is another example of that. So again, we're allowed to vicariously participate in criminal offenses, but as an offender, we still restore moral order. We still restore the balance of justice. We identify with the avenger or the person who sets justice right. Again, we're allowed to be disciplined, affirm punishment, be on the side of the law, be intelligent, solve crimes when we can identify with the person that's participating in the pursuit of justice. I guess I put this photo here because I really like Silence of the Lambs. This is from Silence of the Lambs, and that was a character that at the time when I saw it, I identified with, and liked the idea of being able to psychologically solve a crime. So I kind of vicariously enjoyed that because of that film. And there are probably others where you do too, a particular crime fighter that you identify with and enjoy participating in the solving of that crime with that character. Okay, for a good portion of this book, and actually for pretty much the rest of the class, we're going to begin to do film analysis. With all the assumptions that Rafter makes about films. Now, she has selected particular films, and I'll talk about that in a second. But how do we identify films? Well, one of the ways in which she began to select films for her book, at one point she tried to identify all of the crime films that had been made. During her search, she identified 10,000 films. Now, she wrote this book, and I think it was revised in the early 2000s. Since then, there's been thousands more films made, but you can't sit and watch and analyze 10,000 films. So she had to first begin to winnow out what films she wouldn't watch and what films she would exclude from her analysis or from the analysis of her book. She used genres as one way to begin to winnow out the films that she would not include in this analysis. Now, genre in and of itself is a simple word. We're all familiar with it. It originates from the Latin, meaning class or kind, and basically it's the categorization of films or music or television shows or even books by similar narrative themes. So when you go to Barnes & Noble and you see fiction or mysteries or romance, there's similar narrative themes that hold the books in that collection in common. Maybe if you have a film collection, I've actually had some students that would admit this, you organize your film collection by genre so that you'll know what kind of film you want on a particular evening. Maybe you want to watch a horror flick, and so you can go to that section. But it's some kind of taxonomy or some kind of typology of film. Now, this is just a quote about the complexity and the extent to which people have tried to categorize films. They can try to be categorized on story content, whether they're adaptations. If you look at the Academy Award list, there's a lot of different ways in which they try to categorize films. Book adaptations, original screenplays, musicals. You could try to categorize them based on financial success, on critical reception. There are a lot of ways, but generally we try to hold to this idea that film genres are circle around a narrative or are somehow defined by that narrative of the film. Now, there are some film genre basics. Generally, when we talk about films, we talk about two major categories, documentary and fiction. The assumption is that documentary films are true and factual, and fictitious films are not true and are not factual. I would argue that this separation, while it makes sense thematically, isn't always true. We know that a documentary uses the same types of production techniques and editing techniques as a regular fictitious film does. Michael Moore, in one scene of Bowling for Columbine, there's a speech where Charlton Heston is speaking to the crowd in Denver during the NRA meeting that followed the Columbine shootings. And it looks in the film as if it's one long speech, or at least the assumption the viewer has is that it's one long speech. But in actuality, there are two speeches that have been cut together, and you can see his clothes change from the first part of the speech to the second part of the speech. So that's a film technique, a technique of editing. Is that true? Is that fact? Is that false? Well, clearly we were given the perception that that was one speech at one time, statements that were made, but that wasn't the fact in that particular film. So the point I want to make is not that documentaries deal with true life events, but they're still produced. They're not fictionalized true life events, but they still are edited, produced, developed products that aren't necessarily actual truth that's being presented. If you've seen the film Capturing the Freedmans, it's an excellent example of how a documentary cannot tell you anything about the particular crime that's occurred, because memory and interviews and the editing process, all of this can help shape our ideas of what actually happened, and that may or may not actually be true, but it's still a film that deals with factual events. We're very familiar with fictitious genres: action, comedy, gangster films, dramas, science fiction, westerns. Again, the idea is that fiction deals with purely fictitious narratives or stories. The line, I want to make another point, the line between documentaries and fiction is blurring. This is true. I think I've mentioned before that Richard Castle from the Castle TV show actually has a book in publication. Not the actor that plays Richard Castle, the character Richard Castle has actually, quote unquote, authored a book that's you can find in Barnes and Noble, which that's a strange a blurring of this real life fiction type product. Dan Brown, if you've read The Da Vinci Code, he likes to tag some of his work factual fiction, and in actuality there are many errors in his facts in a lot of those books. I counted, he argued that there were a particular number of windows on the Louvre. I counted those one time, and he even had that fact wrong. And it was like, well, if you can't get the number of windows on the pyramid in front of the Louvre right, then it's not really factual fiction. But there's this blurring, and it's this blurring that's interesting. I think it's done for marketing purposes, we're seeing a real fuzzy line develop between fact and fiction, documentary and fiction, in current film. Now, not necessarily in traditional film, but in current film. Now, anytime we try to create a typology of film, basically I just wanted to show you this slide to show you that typologies get complicated. If we were, say, take this lollipop, if we were to try and plot Take This Lollipop under a film genre, we might be hard-pressed as to know what to do with it. In fact, we don't have a genre called interactive horror, or interactive crime films yet. We have interactive video games, but not necessarily a film genre like specifically that and Take This Lollipop. Would it be a chiller? Would it be a thriller, a chiller thriller? We could kind of hammer and pick this apart. So when we think of typologies of films, we just want to think of broad commonalities and narratives, and know that every typology has its flaws, and it's going to become much more complex than just trying to shove one film into one particular category. Now, on that note, though, Rafter did decide to exclude westerns. She decided to exclude science fiction films that related to crime. She also decided to exclude war films that were related to crime from her analysis, simply because she felt they were their own standalone genres. They weren't necessarily part of the crime film genre, even though they dealt with topics of crime. Okay. We also can look at how films are broken down even within genres. And this, if we kind of imagine this as a funnel, genre would be the broadest of the category we might assign to a film. There are potentially subgenres of films, or films within the genre crime film that are heist films or murder films, or I'm trying to think of other types of kidnapping films. So we would have subgenres, and we can maybe classify them by different types of crimes that occur within the broader genre of crime film. We could have works with shared subjects, themes, or characters. So within the subgenre heist films, I've seen this more often in TV. If you remember Richard Belzer, I think that's his name. He was on several crime shows as the same character, but on different crime shows. So he moved to SVU, but played the same character as he did in a crime show that was set in Baltimore sometime before that. So he was, again, there would have been two works that shared the same subject, crime, and shared the same character. He played exactly the same character that he did in a previous crime show, even though that crime show was at a different police department, had different other characters. Spin-offs would fall into this category, where they're not exactly the same, but they share the same subject, themes, and characters. If you were a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, Angel would be an example of this type of work. Then we can also say that there's films in a series where the plots are very similar, the same characters. They're not spin-offs, they're series. So trying to think of a crime film that's in a series. The Mel Gibson films, there are a lot of those that are in a series. I'm sure you all are thinking of off the top of your head of several crime. The Oceans series would be some of them. All of those would be ways of further refining the category of genre. Okay, the last part of the introduction, she talks about forms of crime films, and we'll talk about this again next lecture 2. But I want to outline these definitions really quickly for you. I think this is probably the most interesting part of her book that she presents. She argues that there are basically two major forms of crime films, that there are traditional crime films and there are critical crime films. I will call critical crime films on occasion postmodern crime films, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that in the next session. But I tend to use critical and postmodern interchangeably when I talk about these films. But traditional crime films offer us moral certainty. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy. We know who the bad guy is relatively early on. And we have a clear struggle between good and bad that's going on. Many of the crime shows on TV now are like that. The CSIs, the NCIS, all of those types of shows, we have moral certainty. There's a good person and a bad person, or a good group of people and a bad group of people. And those characterizations are good. We often have visual representations in these films of what makes someone good or bad. If you remember, not just films, but in comics, if you remember some of the early comics, Dick Tracy had a relatively normal, handsome, human-looking face. But he would come up against criminals that actually had very, very distorted features, crazy shaped heads and wild hair and really big noses. I mean, all of these attributes, if you just look up a Dick Tracy comic, you'll see what I'm talking about. But there was a clear visual clue that Dick Tracy is good. The criminals look bad. And the westerns, the white hats and the black hats. There are plenty of visual clues that help us determine what's good and bad in a traditional film. Critical or postmodern films actually began to develop in the 70s. They offer us moral ambiguity. We don't always know who the good guy is, who the bad guy is. There tends to be a lack of heroes. The good guys are often very, very flawed individuals, people who are reluctantly good, or come to the good decision out of character, in a way that it's not really part of who they really are, but they kind of have to make the good decision. We don't really have a clear narrative. One of the other attributes of a traditional film is that it generally follows a linear timeline. We start at point A, and in time we go to point B. In critical or postmodern films, we tend to have multiple endings. The narratives don't necessarily end. The points of view changes. I believe Crash is one of these films. I'm using Memento as one of these films. Usual Suspects, the Denzel Washington film where he's the corrupt police officer. There are several films that we see coming up since the 70s that fit this critical definition, and we'll talk about this later. Okay, and next we'll be talking about the history of crime films.